Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first and most likely last episode of the podcast. Today, we're looking at one of the most fascinating and politically important migration stories to come out of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, that being the massive and sudden movement of Russian migrants journeying across the Caucasus into the neighboring state of Georgia. Shortly after the war began 3 years ago, over 100,000 Russians entered the country, fleeing political repression, military conscription, or the consequences of the simple crime of refusing to support the Kremlin's latest conflict. At the peak of the migration in September of 2022, more than 200,000 migrants had entered the country. For a place like Georgia, which currently has around 3.6 million people, this meant a huge shock to their demographics, economy, and everyday life. This story extends beyond the sheer number of migrants coming to such a small country. It's really about a storied history of conflict, an increasingly corrupt government, and the restrictive policies which have been enacted upon the people currently fleeing a dictatorship. Georgia was absolutely unprepared for the wave of arrivals which came to their northern border in September of 2022, all of whom had visa-free entry due to the relative strength of the Russian passport in the Caucasus and Central Asia. Within months of this arrival, rent prices had doubled in parts of Tbilisi and Batumi, leading the locals to feel as if they're being pushed out of their own cities, dredging up feelings of hatred and oppression left over from Soviet occupation just a few decades ago. Economics, however, isn't the only issue. Georgia still sees Russia as an occupying power, as since 2008, Russian soldiers have remained in the contested regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, making up around 1/5 of Georgian territory. According to a survey by the Center for East European and International Studies, public sentiment towards the migrants is deeply split among locals. Some Georgians sympathize with the Russians fleeing Putin's authoritarian regime, while others see them as a national threat to security, or even as a vessel to implant Russian culture yet again within the country. Next, we'll listen to a Georgian bureaucrat speaking on the situation while attending an anti-migrant demonstration at the Russian border.
On the background of the military mobilization in the Russian Federation, hundreds and thousands of Russian citizens cross Russia-Georgian border every day. Georgian side has no precise information who those individuals are and what their real intention is while arriving in Georgia. The Georgian government, which very openly cooperates with the Russian FSB, does nothing to respond to the threats, risks and challenges coming from Russia. But when the government enacts, we, the Georgian people, should demonstrate our position very clear. We believe that such kind of migration from Russia in Georgia poses an imminent threat to Georgia's national security, Georgia's economy and stability in general.
That was Giga Lemonyava, executive secretary of the country's center-right pro-European opposition party known as the DROA party. They are known for their heavy involvement in activism and public demonstrations within the country. The Georgian opposition parties are currently in the process of enacting several repressive measures against the migrants, including the possible change of visa-free travel for Russian nationals, refusal of service in both public and private sectors, even in businesses which are essentially impossible to live properly without, like government offices and banks. This is alongside a mandatory occupation tax, which all migrants must pay upon arrival in order to offset their presence in the country, and loyalty declarations, which must be signed at most businesses to show their disapproval for the actions of the Russian government. Now, why exactly are Russians going to Georgia in the first place? Why would anyone willingly take the trek through multiple unstable provinces like Chechnya and Dagestan and face the harsh conditions of the Caucasus just to cross over to this tiny country? Well, as mentioned, there are no visa requirements as of now, which for the average Russian citizen living below the poverty line saves hundreds of dollars as opposed to a flight plus a visa fee to an EU state. Alongside this, Georgia serves as a perfect middle point for the emerging migration corridor from Russia to the Caucasus or Central Asia, then to any number of countries in the EU. Their shared history under the Soviet Union helps as well, as a good number of Georgians do speak or understand Russian at the very least, reducing the gaps in communication which are normal with migration. The Georgian people themselves, though, see this situation completely differently, as they still hold fears of cultural dissolution from large numbers of Russians entering the country, as well as worries about national security and possible espionage attempting to sabotage the country from within. To really understand why these policies are being enacted, it's important to look at similar situations on a global scale. Around the world, waves of migrants coming from politically hostile states are usually securitized and discriminated against, leading to the internalization of borders. I mean, you can look at the experiences of Muslims in the US post 9/11, or even the covertly Islamophobic secularism law in Quebec, known as Bill 21. The sociologist Hein de Haas, in his book How Migration Really Works, talks about several of the myths that end up feeding into the securitization. Namely that migrants take jobs from locals, cause price increases, and dilute cultural identity, all the same fears which Georgians are facing now. Though these are fundamental tactics used by populists, usually to garner fear in their citizens, they do work, more often than not because they prey on fears that any regular person would have, like economic security and personal safety. In Georgia, by contrast, these restrictions are not just about regulation. They are much more symbolic in nature, meant to assert cultural control and create distance from Russia, both as a state and as a political ally, especially when they're actively waging war in the region. Regulation around this issue happens on multiple levels, both officially and unofficially. Nationally speaking, the ruling Georgian Dream Party holds an open stance on migration as they're aligned with Putin's government and, of course, enjoy the economic benefits of an influx of young, educated migrants. The opposition, in the form of the United National Movement, is pushing for the restrictions such as those mentioned earlier. Locally, landlords, banks, and employers will often impose their own informal rules, sometimes including ideological tests and the aforementioned loyalty declarations. Sometimes they won't serve migrants at all, no matter their views on Russia's government. On an international level, the EU is pressuring Georgia to modernize its migration governance as part of its status as an EU candidate state. Despite the regulations, protests, and general tension around their presence in the country, Russian migrants are far from silent on this issue. Local scholars like Maryam Darchiashvili, Ketevan Gurchiani, Nikita Mishakov, and Keres Schenk have all put together policy memos over the past few years detailing the ways in which Russian migrants are dealing with these policies. They write about the process of forming solidarity networks and social groups over secure digital platforms like Telegram and Signal, used to share useful information and to build community networks to better navigate their new lives in Georgia. Some of them have even taken public political stances, including attending anti-war rallies, donating to Ukrainian causes and charities, even making public declarations against the Russian government, solidifying their inability to return home without imprisonment or punishment. Others, however, prioritize cultural adaptation and integration by learning Georgian, supporting local businesses, and trying their best to assimilate into Georgian society. Another interesting layer to this issue is how resistance towards Putin's government has shaped diaspora politics for Russian migrants around the world. Scholars on migration argue that diasporas often become an extension of the political actors within their home countries, becoming political actors in their own right. Needless to say, the majority of Russian migrants actively oppose their government and view migration as both a personal escape and a political statement. Their political and cultural presence in Georgia, no matter your personal views on the matter, are undoubtedly examples of placemaking and diasporic politics. Between the creation of several ethno-burbs in cities like Tbilisi and Batumi, alongside both digital and live activism protesting the war in Ukraine, it's becoming increasingly apparent that this is a community that is impacting several aspects of Georgian society. How the Georgian government plans to deal with the migration wave in the coming years is unknown, as their parliament is still reeling from the scandal surrounding their 2024 federal election and the subsequently disputed president, Mikhail Kavalashvili. How will the migrants themselves continue to deal with this issue? Well, I have hope that they'll keep adapting, as they've done from the start. Since the beginning of the conflict in 2022, they've gone a long way to set up new, safe lives in a foreign state, while continuing to speak out against the actions of their government, along with living under discriminatory policy, which makes everyday tasks next to impossible. To close out the episode, I hope you enjoyed this dive into the conflict-driven migration policy of a region often forgotten by the rest of the world. Thank you so much for listening.